All right, let's go. Number 10. Göbekli Tepe. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd tending his flock on a dusty hilltop in southeastern Turkey noticed something strange protruding from the soil. The shape was wrong. Too straight, too deliberate, too geometric for any stone that wind and rain alone could have shaped. He reported it to the local museum. Within months, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt would stand on that same hilltop and recognize, with a clarity that would unravel a century of consensus about human prehistory, that he was standing on top of something that should not exist. Göbekli Tepe is 12,000 years old. Not 12,000 years old in the loose sense of ancient. 12,000 years old in the precise, carbon-dated, stratigraphically verified sense. It predates Stonehenge by 7,000 years. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by 7,500 years. It predates the invention of pottery, the invention of the wheel, the invention of writing, and the domestication of every crop and animal that would later make permanent settlement possible. It predates agriculture itself. The site consists of massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing up to 18 feet tall and weighing as much as 20 tons. They are arranged in circular enclosures, embedded in retaining walls, oriented with deliberate precision toward points on the horizon and points in the sky. Their surfaces are carved in shallow relief with foxes, vultures, scorpions, snakes, wild boar, and creatures that don't comfortably match any animal known to have walked the hills of Anatolia in the 11th millennium BC. The carving is not crude. The carving is not the tentative work of a people just learning to shape stone. The carving is confident, stylized, and consistent across pillars separated by meters of bedrock. The visual signature of a tradition that had already been refined for generations before the first stone at Göbekli Tepe was ever raised. The people who built it were hunter-gatherers. They had no villages. They had no granaries. They had no metallurgy, no draft animals, no agricultural surplus, no kings, no scribes, and according to every model of human development that anthropology spent the 20th century constructing, no possible reason or means to quarry, transport, and erect monolithic stone columns weighing more than a modern truck. And yet, they did. Repeatedly. Across an area covering roughly 22 acres, with at least 20 enclosures identified by ground-penetrating radar, most of which remain unexcavated beneath the soil. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. In 2017, engineer and researcher Martin Sweatman at the University of Edinburgh published an analysis of the carvings on Pillar 43, known as the Vulture Stone, in the journal Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry. His team argued that the animal figures arranged across the pillar's face were not decorative. They were not totemic. They were astronomical. Specific constellations, rendered in the symbolic language of the people who carved them, positioned to record the sky as it appeared on a specific date. The date Sweatman's analysis returned was approximately 10,950 BC, and the event the pillar appeared to commemorate was a catastrophic comet impact, a fragmenting body that struck the northern hemisphere and helped trigger the Younger Dryas cold reversal that reshaped the climate of the entire planet. If Sweatman is correct, the carvings on Pillar 43 are not art. They are a map. Not a map of land, but a map of the sky, frozen at the moment a world ended. The oldest known map in human history, predating the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia by 7,000 years, predating every cartographic artifact we have ever cataloged, recorded in stone by people who were not supposed to be capable of recording anything at all. And then, around 8,000 BC, the builders of Göbekli Tepe did something stranger still. They buried it. Deliberately, methodically, they filled the enclosures with rubble and soil, covering their pillars, their carvings, their map of the sky, and walked away. Why they buried it, what they were trying to preserve or protect or seal away, No one knows. The hill sat silent for 10,000 years, waiting for a shepherd to notice a shape in the dirt that was just slightly too straight. Number 9. The Olmec. In the dense lowland jungles of Veracruz and Tabasco, on the humid Gulf Coast of southern Mexico, archaeologists have spent over a century pulling faces out of the earth. Colossal faces. Stone heads carved from single blocks of dark volcanic basalt, some weighing as much as 50 tons, some standing nearly 11 feet tall, staring out from beneath helmets of an unknown design with expressions that have survived 3,000 years of rain, root, and lichen. The basalt has weathered to a mottled green where moisture and microbial growth have colonized the stone. The features have not. The eyes, the mouths, the broad sculpted cheeks remain intact, recognizable, watching. These are the Olmec. They flourished between approximately 1500 and 400 BC along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, and they represent the earliest known major civilization of Mesoamerica. Everything that came after them, the Maya, the Zapotec, the Toltec, the Aztec, built on foundations the Olmec laid first. Calendrical systems, ritual ball games, jade carving traditions, the architectural template of the ceremonial center. All of it traces backward through the archaeological record to the same source. The major sites, San Lorenzo and La Venta, were urban ceremonial complexes operating at a level of sophistication that should not have existed in the Americas at that time, and we do not know what these people called themselves. The name Olmec is a designation imposed by outsiders thousands of years later, derived from a Nahuatl word meaning rubber people, applied by the Aztecs to the inhabitants of the region long after the original civilization had collapsed. The Olmec left no decipherable written record of their own identity. Their language is lost. Their self-conception is lost. We have inherited their monuments without inheriting their name for themselves. But here's where the conventional reading of Olmec material culture begins to fracture. A growing body of researchers has proposed that the carved stone monuments of San Lorenzo and La Venta are not simply religious iconography or dynastic portraits. They are cosmological maps. The arrangement of monuments within ceremonial precincts, the orientations of altars, the placement of the colossal heads in relation to ritual axes. All of it appears to encode spatial information. Not maps of land in the modern cartographic sense, but maps of cosmos, of territory, of the relationships between the world above, the world below, and the world the Olmec walked. The stone itself is the document. The basalt for the colossal heads was quarried in the Tuxtla Mountains and transported, by means still not fully understood, across distances of up to 90 kilometers, through swamp, across rivers, without wheels, without draft animals. 50-ton blocks of volcanic rock moved through terrain that modern engineers would hesitate to cross with heavy machinery. The Olmec did this repeatedly, deliberately, and at scale. The helmeted features of the colossal heads remain unexplained. Some researchers read them as ballplayer headgear. Others see them as warrior helms, or ritual regalia, or markers of dynastic lineage. No interpretation has achieved consensus. The faces themselves, broad-nosed, full-lipped, heavy-lidded, have generated decades of speculation about Olmec origins, most of it more ideological than archaeological. The honest answer is that we are looking at portraits of people whose identity we cannot recover and whose meaning we cannot reconstruct. What remains is the basalt, the mapped ceremonial space, the encoded cosmology built into the placement of stone, a civilization that established the template for every Mesoamerican culture that followed, then vanished from history without leaving behind the one thing every other civilization has bequeathed to us, its own word for itself. The Olmec are real. They are verified. They are present in the archaeological record in tonnages of carved stone that cannot be argued with. And yet the most basic question, who were these people in their own voice, has no answer at all. The map they left is one we have not yet learned to read. Number 8. Doggerland. When the North Sea swallowed a country. In 1931, a British fishing trawler called the Kalinda hauled its nets from the waters between England and Denmark and found something that should not have been there. Tangled among the cod and seaweed was a lump of peat. Embedded inside it, perfectly preserved, was a barbed antler point shaped by human hands. The artifact had been dredged from the seafloor more than 100 feet beneath the open ocean. Fishermen had pulled a hunter's weapon from the bottom of a sea where no hunter should ever have stood. The weapon was real. The hunter was real. The land he walked on was gone. That land has a name now. Doggerland. During the last glacial maximum, sea levels across the North Atlantic sat roughly 120 meters lower than they do today. The basin we call the North Sea was not a sea at all. It was a continent's worth of low country, a rolling expanse of tundra, marshland, oak forests, and slow black rivers that connected the eastern coast of Britain to the lowlands of the Netherlands, Denmark, and the Jutland Peninsula. Mammoth grazed there. Red deer moved through the woodlands in seasonal migrations. Aurochs, the massive wild cattle whose horns spanned 6 feet, drank from the river systems that drained an entire submerged watershed. This was not marginal territory. This was prime habitat. And for thousands of years, Mesolithic communities thrived on it. We know this because the seafloor will not stop giving them back. For nearly a century, North Sea fishing fleets have hauled up the residue of a vanished world. Flint blades, bone harpoons, carved antler tools, mammoth tusks blackened by millennia in cold mud, human skull fragments, each artifact a single sentence from a library that drowned. The trawlers were not excavating. They were stumbling, dragging their nets across the buried topography of someone else's homeland. The mapping of that homeland is the work of one man and one project above all others. In 2007, archaeologist Vince Gaffney at the University of Birmingham began something unprecedented. Using seismic survey data originally collected by the North Sea oil industry, his team reconstructed the topography of Doggerland in detail no one had thought possible. The data had been gathered to find petroleum reservoirs. Gaffney repurposed it to find rivers. The bathymetric maps that emerged from his work showed a landscape larger than many modern European nations. River valleys winding for hundreds of kilometers toward ancient estuaries. Hill ranges and lake beds. Coastlines that retreated and advanced as the climate shifted. A complete geography rendered in shades of submerged stone. Every feature still there, just buried beneath the cold gray water of the modern North Sea. The implications of those maps are difficult to absorb. At its maximum extent, Doggerland could have supported tens of thousands of Mesolithic inhabitants. Not a scattered handful of nomadic bands, a population, a network of settlements, hunting territories, seasonal camps, river crossings, burial grounds, and the trails between them. An entire human geography spread across a country that no living person has ever seen. Then, the ice melted. Between roughly 8,000 and 6,500 BC, sea levels rose with brutal patience. The coastlines retreated inland year after year. Communities watched estuaries become bays. Bays become open water. Hunting grounds become shallows. Generation after generation, they relocated. They adapted. They walked away from the homes their grandparents had built. By 6,500 BC, the last high ground had vanished. Whatever survivors remained were absorbed into the populations of Britain and continental Europe, carrying with them the memory of a country that no longer existed. What makes Doggerland the cornerstone of this entire list is its honesty. There is no speculation here. No esoteric map, no fringe theorist, no contested interpretation. Doggerland is a verified prehistoric world, scientifically mapped, archaeologically attested, and completely lost. It is the proof of concept for everything the older legends only hint at. Drowned countries are not myth. They are geology. And once you accept that the North Sea hides one of them, the next question writes itself. What else is down there? What larger landmass on the far side of the planet might have cradled something more than hunters with antler harpoons? Number 7. Sundaland, the drowned continent at the cradle of human myth. In 1999, geneticist Stephen Oppenheimer, working at the University of Oxford, published a book that connected genetic evidence, climate data, and the world's flood myths into a single audacious theory. Beneath the warm, shallow seas of modern Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Java Sea lies the submerged shelf of an entire subcontinent. Oppenheimer proposed that this drowned land, not the Mediterranean, not the Atlantic, was the original cradle of advanced human civilization. He called his hypothesis Eden in the East. The garden, in his telling, was real. It had simply been swallowed by the sea. The geography is not speculation. During the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, sea levels worldwide stood roughly 120 meters lower than they do today. Water that now fills the world's oceans was locked into the ice sheets, crushing North America and Northern Europe. In Southeast Asia, the consequence was extraordinary. The shallow seas between modern Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula simply did not exist. In their place stretched a vast continental landmass that geologists call Sundaland. The numbers redraw the map of human prehistory. At its maximum extent, Sundaland covered an area roughly twice the size of India. Tropical lowlands extended unbroken from the foothills of mainland Asia to the edge of what is now the Java Trench. Massive river systems, larger than the modern Mekong, drained the highlands and carved valleys across the plain. Bathymetric surveys of the seafloor have mapped the ancient riverbeds in remarkable detail. The courses are still there, traced into the submerged sediment, leading nowhere now but toward the deep. This was not marginal terrain. Sundaland sat directly on the equator. Rainfall was abundant. Temperatures were stable. The forests would have been some of the most biologically productive ecosystems on Earth, teeming with game, fruit, freshwater fish, and timber. While humans in northern Europe huddled at the edges of glaciers and Saharan grasslands were only beginning to green, the inhabitants of Sundaland lived in conditions closer to paradise than any other region on the planet. A territory twice the size of India, rich with rivers and forests, tropical, fertile, and stable for tens of thousands of years. But here's where the conventional story of civilization collapses. Mainstream archaeology places the first agricultural revolution in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 BC and treats Southeast Asia as a peripheral receiver of culture from the West. Oppenheimer's reconstruction inverts this entirely. He argued that the rising seas at the end of the last ice age did not gradually inconvenience Sundaland's inhabitants. They obliterated their world. Beginning around 14,000 years ago and culminating in catastrophic pulses, the ocean climbed. By approximately 11,000 years ago, the heartland of Sundaland was gone. Coastlines retreated by kilometers per generation. Entire river deltas, the most fertile and densely populated zones of any pre-industrial society, vanished beneath warm tropical water. The survivors, in Oppenheimer's model, fled in every direction. West toward India and Mesopotamia, north into mainland Asia, east across the Pacific. They carried with them agricultural knowledge, seafaring skill, astronomical traditions, and one shared memory burned into the cultural foundation of every civilization they seeded. The memory of a lost homeland devoured by the sea. The implications are staggering. The flood narratives that appear in Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Greek, Indian, Chinese, and Polynesian traditions are not, in this reading, independent literary inventions. They are fractured recollections of the same event. The Eden of Genesis, the Atlantis of Plato, the drowned ancestral lands described in dozens of Southeast Asian oral traditions. All of them, Oppenheimer argued, refract a single geological catastrophe through the long telephone of human memory. The garden was not metaphor, it was a continent, and it sank. Mainstream archaeology has not accepted the civilization half of the hypothesis. The geography it rests on, however, is beyond dispute. Sundaland existed. It was twice the size of India. It is now buried beneath shallow tropical seas, its riverbeds still legible on the seafloor, its forests turned to sediment, its inhabitants, whoever they were, scattered or drowned. Whatever they built, the warm water keeps. Number 6. The Yonaguni Monument. In 1986, a Japanese diver named Kihachiro Aratake was scouting new locations for hammerhead shark tourism off the southern coast of Yonaguni Island, the westernmost inhabited point in Japan, sitting closer to Taiwan than to Tokyo. The water there is famously rough. Strong Pacific currents sweep the reef. Grouper the size of refrigerators patrol the deeper channels. Arataki descended through the blue haze, expecting nothing more than coral and sandstone. The standard topography of the Ryukyu archipelago. What he found instead has been the subject of one of the most heated disputes in modern archaeology for nearly 4 decades. 80 feet beneath the surface, a structure rose from the seabed. Not a reef, not a coral outcrop. A formation of massive sandstone slabs arranged with sharp, repeating 90-degree angles, terraced into what looked like steps cut for something larger than a human being. There were broad, flat platforms. There was a sunken depression that some divers immediately compared to a stadium. There were channels that appeared deliberately cut into the rock, and projections that, viewed from certain angles in the right light, resembled faces. The whole formation stretched over 150 meters in length and rose more than 25 meters from the seafloor. It looked, to the divers who first swam its edges, like a city. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura at the University of the Ryukyus began surveying the site shortly after its discovery and has continued his research for over 3 decades. Kimura's conclusion was, and remains, that the Yonaguni Monument is at least partially man-made. His mapping identified what he interpreted as a castle, an arch, a triumphal road, and the remains of carved sculptures, including a feature he called the turtle, and a section he believes once depicted a human face in low relief. Kimura's dating, based on the depth of the structure and known sea level fluctuations in the western Pacific, places the formation's exposure to open air sometime before the end of the last ice age. If his interpretation holds, the monument was carved when its terraces stood above the waterline, which would mean it was built more than 10,000 years ago. The numbers, if Kimura is correct, are devastating to the conventional timeline. 10,000 years ago places the construction of Yonaguni before the founding of Jericho, before the agricultural revolution in Mesopotamia, before the domestication of cattle, before the first ceramic vessels were fired anywhere on Earth. A civilization capable of cutting terraces and carving faces into solid sandstone at that depth, at that scale, would predate every known civilization in the human record, not by centuries, by thousands of years. But here's where the standard explanation fights back hard. The mainstream geological consensus, articulated most forcefully by Boston University geologist Robert Schoch after his own dives at the site, is that Yonaguni is a natural formation. The sandstone in that region of the Ryukyus fractures along clean perpendicular planes. Tectonic stress, wave action, and the relentless scouring of Pacific currents can produce remarkably geometric features, including right angles, flat surfaces, and terraced steps that look engineered, but are simply the way that particular stone breaks. Schoch and his colleagues argue that pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive faces and architecture in random patterns, accounts for the rest. The carved face is shadow. The stadium is a depression. The road is a fracture plane. And yet, the site refuses to settle the question. Divers continue to report features that resist easy geological explanation. Holes that appear drilled, channels that turn at angles no fracture should produce, stones that seem to have been moved and stacked. Kimura's team has documented what they interpret as tool marks. The currents at Yonaguni are violent enough to discourage extended investigation. Visibility shifts without warning. The groupers watch from the deeper recesses of the structure with the indifference of animals that have lived there for longer than the argument above them has existed. Whatever Yonaguni is, it sits 80 feet beneath the Pacific, scoured by currents that have been working its edges for 10,000 years, while two camps of credentialed scientists stand on opposite shores of the same sandstone and reach incompatible conclusions about whether human hands ever touched it. The water keeps its silence. The angles remain. Number 5. The Bimini Road and the drowned causeways of the Caribbean. In September of 1968, a zoologist named Dr. J. Manson Valentine was diving in the shallow turquoise waters off the coast of North Bimini Island in the Bahamas when he saw something on the seafloor that stopped him cold. Beneath roughly 18 feet of clear Caribbean water, partially veiled by sand and encrusted with centuries of coral growth, lay a line of massive, rectangular limestone blocks extending into the distance. Not scattered, not random, arranged. The blocks ran in a single deliberate course, stretching nearly half a mile beneath the shallows, terminating in a curious J-shaped hook at one end. Some of the stones measured 10 to 13 feet across. Many sat with their edges aligned at angles that looked too precise to be accidental. Valentine documented the formation, photographed it, and gave it a name that would echo through alternative archaeology for the next half-century. The Bimini Road. The discovery did not happen in a vacuum. Decades earlier, in the 1930s, the American clairvoyant Edgar Cayce had delivered a series of trance readings in which he predicted that remnants of Atlantis would rise from the sea near Bimini in 1968 or 1969. When Valentine's photographs reached the public, the timing struck many as impossible to ignore. A line of cut stones appearing on the exact island Cayce had named, in the exact year he had specified, sitting on the floor of a sea that had been dry land during the last glacial maximum when sea levels were 120 meters lower than today. To the believers, the prediction had been fulfilled. To the geologists, a coincidence had been weaponized. The numbers complicate both sides of the argument. During the last ice age, the Great Bahama Bank was an exposed limestone plateau, dry land stretching across an area larger than modern Florida. Any structure built on that plateau before approximately 10,000 years ago would now sit beneath the shallow seas that flooded the region as the ice sheets melted. Speculative cartographers working from bathymetric data and Cayce's readings have produced maps tracing entire networks of supposed causeways, harbors, and submerged settlements arcing through the Bahamas, the Florida Keys, and along the underwater shelves of Cuba and Hispaniola. The maps are not evidence, but they describe a geography that at one point in deep prehistory actually existed above the waves. But here's where the conventional explanation refuses to settle the matter. Beginning in the 1970s, geologists led by Eugene Shin of the U.S. Geological Survey examined the Bimini blocks and concluded they were natural beach rock, a type of carbonate sandstone that forms in the intertidal zone and fractures along straight, perpendicular joints as it cools and dries. Core samples appeared to show consistent layering across multiple blocks, suggesting they had formed as a single sheet that later cracked into rectangular sections. The verdict from mainstream science was unambiguous. Beach rock, nothing more. And yet the blocks continue to unsettle the people who actually swim among them. Some stones appear to rest on smaller pillow stones, as if deliberately propped level. Others show tool-like notches along their edges. Subsequent expeditions have reported finding what appear to be worked granite and marble fragments at the site, materials that do not occur naturally in the Bahamas and would have to have been transported from elsewhere. The pattern is consistent. Every explanation closes one door and opens another. What remains is a line of stones in shallow water, encrusted with coral, lit by the filtered green light of a tropical sea, sitting on a plateau that was once dry land, walked by human beings whose names we will never know. Whether the Bimini Road is the work of those people, or the work of the limestone itself, it is the kind of question that the Atlantic has not yet chosen to answer. And the deeper questions about what civilizations may have existed before the ice melted do not stop at the edge of the water. Some of them, according to the oldest maps in Europe, point north. Number 4. Hyperborea, the polar civilization at the top of the world. In 1595, the Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator, the man whose projection still shapes how every modern human visualizes the globe, published a map of the Arctic that should not exist. At the top of the world, where modern atlases show only ocean and shifting sea ice, Mercator drew 4 enormous islands arranged around a central point. At the exact geographic pole, he placed a single black rock surrounded by a swirling whirlpool sea. The 4 landmasses, separated by rushing inland channels, formed a perfect symmetrical wheel around the magnetic mountain at the planet's crown. This was not decorative speculation. This was a working navigational chart from the most respected cartographer in Europe. The civilization said to have lived there was called Hyperborea. The name appears in Greek texts more than 2,000 years before Mercator drew his map. Hesiod referenced them in the 8th century BC. Pindar wrote of them in the 5th. The accounts agree on the essential details. The Hyperboreans were a tall, long-lived people who lived in a land of eternal sunlight, untouched by disease, war, or aging. Their homeland sat beyond the north wind, beyond the territory the Greeks understood as inhabitable. They were not mythological in the way of gods or monsters. They were described as humans, just better, wiser, older, closer to whatever the Greeks believed humanity had once been before it forgot. For most of recorded history, scholars treated Hyperborea as poetic invention, a literary device for an idealized North. But Mercator's map did not treat it as metaphor. He drew it as geography. The numbers around the map's production are telling. Mercator was the most rigorous cartographer of the 16th century. He revolutionized navigation. His maps were used by sailors whose lives depended on their accuracy. He did not draw 4 polar islands surrounding a magnetic mountain, because he was speculating. In correspondence preserved from the period, Mercator claimed his polar geography was based on a 14th century text called the Inventio Fortunata, an account allegedly written by an English friar who had traveled to the Arctic. That manuscript no longer exists. Every copy has been lost. What survives is Mercator's map, drawn from a source that vanished from the historical record almost the moment it was used. But here's where the standard explanation begins to fracture. When polar exploration finally reached the Arctic in the 19th and 20th centuries, the 4 islands were not there. The magnetic mountain was not there. The swirling whirlpool sea was not there. There was only ocean, ice, and the slow drift of frozen water across a pole that has no land beneath it. Mercator's geography was wrong in a way that is almost impossible to explain by ordinary error. He did not draw a vague northern landmass. He drew a specific, symmetrical, architecturally precise polar continent that does not exist and, according to every geological survey ever conducted, never existed within the time frame of human civilization. The implications divide cleanly into 2 impossibilities. Either Mercator and his vanished source invented an entire polar geography out of nothing and presented it as fact in the most authoritative cartographic work of the European Renaissance. Or the Inventio Fortunata recorded something its author believed to be true, drawn from a tradition of polar knowledge whose origin we cannot trace. The Greeks wrote of Hyperboreans 20 centuries before, Mercator. A 14th century friar wrote of polar islands. A 16th century cartographer drew them with the confidence of measured fact. And then the maps stopped agreeing with the world. What makes Hyperborea particularly unsettling is not the absence of the islands. It is the persistence of the description. Across 2.5 millennia, separated by language, religion, and continent, the accounts converge on the same essential geography: a land at the top of the world, a people taller and longer lived than ourselves, a civilization existing in light that never fails. The Inventio Fortunata is gone. Mercator is dead. The pole has been mapped to the meter. And somewhere in the gap between Greek poetry and Renaissance, cartography sits a civilization that the most rigorous mapmaker in European history believed was real enough to draw. Number 3. Lemuria and Mu. In 1864, a British zoologist named Philip Sclater published a short article in the Quarterly Journal of Science attempting to solve a problem that had been troubling naturalists for decades. Lemur fossils were turning up in places that made no geographical sense. The primates appeared in Madagascar. They appeared in India. They appeared scattered across the Indian Ocean basin in patterns that suggested the animals had once moved freely across territory that no longer existed. Sclater proposed a solution: a vast sunken continent stretching across the Indian Ocean, a lost landmass that had connected Africa to South Asia before subsiding beneath the waves. He gave it a name drawn from the very creatures whose fossils had inspired the theory: Lemuria. The proposal was scientific in intent. It was also entirely wrong. But the name had been spoken into the world, and the world was not finished with it. Within a decade, Lemuria had been seized by a different kind of cartographer. In 1888, the Russian occultist Helena Blavatsky incorporated the lost continent into the cosmology of her theosophical movement, declaring Lemuria the home of the third root race of humanity, a civilization of giants who had walked the earth millions of years before modern humans, who had possessed psychic abilities and esoteric knowledge, who had perished when their continent sank beneath the Indian Ocean. The fossil distribution problem that had inspired Sclater's hypothesis was no longer the point. Lemuria had become a spiritual homeland. Then came Churchward. In the 1920s, a retired British officer named James Churchward published a series of books claiming to have decoded ancient tablets shown to him by a priest in India. The tablets, he insisted, described a Pacific continent called Mu, not Indian Ocean, Pacific. Churchward redrew the map. His Mu stretched from Hawaii to Easter Island, a vast emerald green landmass dotted with stone temples and pyramids, populated by 64 million inhabitants, the cradle of all subsequent human civilization. The maps he printed in his books depicted Mu in lush, hand-drawn detail. Rivers winding through tropical forests, cities rising from coastal plains, a continent the size of South America placed in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth. There was no priest. There were no tablets. The original Lemuria of the fossil record and the Mu of Churchward's invention merged in the popular imagination into a single lost world, and the merger has never fully come apart. The science arrived later and was unambiguous. Plate tectonics, formalized in the 1960s, demonstrated that continents do not sink. They drift. They collide. They fold upward into mountain ranges and grind apart along fault lines. They do not subside into oceanic depths over the course of a few millennia, taking civilizations with them. The seafloor of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific has been mapped in detail. There is no submerged continental crust where Lemuria or Mu were said to exist. The fossil distribution that troubled Sclater is now explained by continental drift itself. India and Madagascar were once connected, just not in the way he imagined, and not within any time frame relevant to human history. The geological premise is dead. the civilization persists. Lemuria appears in spiritual literature, in channeled texts, in the foundational mythology of New Age movements that locate ancestral memory in a continent that never existed. Mu appears in pulp fiction, in video games, in documentaries that treat Churchward's fabrications as suppressed truth. The maps he drew in the 1920s continue to circulate a century later, reproduced in books and online with the same emerald coloring, the same temple icons, the same confident coastlines tracing a landmass that the ocean floor itself has refused to confirm. What makes Lemuria particularly unsettling is not what it proves about prehistory. It is what it proves about cartography. A map can summon a civilization out of nothing. A map can give that civilization a homeland, a people, a history, a fate. And once the map exists, the civilization it depicts becomes nearly impossible to erase. Number 2. Atlantis, the civilization that refuses to die. In approximately 360 BC, the Athenian philosopher Plato sat down to write 2 dialogues that would haunt Western civilization for the next 24 centuries, the Timaeus and the Critias. In them, he described an island civilization of staggering power and sophistication, situated in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. According to Plato's account, transmitted from the Egyptian priests of Sais to the Athenian statesman Solon, this civilization had existed 9,000 years before his own time. 9,000 years. The number alone should give pause. Plato was writing in the 4th century BC. 9,000 years before him places the existence of Atlantis at approximately 9,600 BC, contemporary with the construction of Göbekli Tepe, predating every accepted civilization on Earth by 6,000 years. Then, according to the account, it sank, not eroded, not declined, not abandoned. In a single day and night of misfortune, the entire island, civilization, was swallowed by the sea. Plato is specific about the suddenness. The catastrophe was total and immediate. The details Plato provides are not the vague gestures of myth. They are architectural, metallurgical, geographical. The capital was built on concentric ring harbors, alternating bands of land and water arranged around a central acropolis, connected by bridges and canals engineered with mathematical precision. The civilization possessed metallurgical mastery centered on a substance Plato calls orichalcum, a copper-gold alloy that glittered like fire and was second only to gold in value. They built temples sheathed in silver and gold. They commanded fleets of 1,200 ships. They ruled an empire that extended across the Mediterranean as far as Egypt and Tyrrhenia before their hubris brought divine punishment down upon them. For nearly 2,000 years after Plato, the story circulated through European thought as philosophy, allegory, and occasional history. Then, in 1669, the German Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher published the map that would define the geography of Atlantis in the Western imagination for the next 350 years. Kircher's map appeared in his work Mundus Subterraneus. It depicts Atlantis as a vast mountainous landmass occupying the central Atlantic Ocean, positioned between the western coast of Africa and the eastern coast of the Americas. The map is drawn upside down by modern cartographic conventions, with south at the top and north at the bottom, Africa rendered on the right side of the page. The island itself is shown ringed by mountains, marked with cities and rivers, presented not as speculation, but as documented geography. Kircher claimed to have based the map on Egyptian sources he had access to in the Vatican archives, sources he believed preserved the same tradition Plato had received through Solon. The map became iconic. It transformed Atlantis from a philosophical parable into a place with coordinates, a landmass that had occupied real ocean before the waters closed over it. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Despite 24 centuries of searching, despite expeditions to the Azores, the Canary Islands, the Bahamas, the Aegean, the Black Sea, Despite sonar surveys of every plausible Atlantic seafloor, no archaeological proof of Atlantis has ever been recovered. Not a wall, not a coin, not a fragment of orichalcum, not a single inscribed stone. The most thoroughly searched lost civilization in human history has yielded nothing, and yet it refuses to die. Atlantis remains the most enduring lost civilization myth in Western culture. Every generation produces new theories, new candidate locations, new claimants to the wreckage. The story has outlasted the empires that searched for it. It has outlasted the cartographic traditions that mapped it. It has outlasted the geological models that dismissed it. There is something in Plato's account that refuses to be filed away as fiction. Some specificity of detail, some weight of tradition behind the narrative, some unsettling possibility that the Egyptian priests really did preserve a memory of something the rest of human history had forgotten. What makes Atlantis particularly haunting is not the question of whether Plato was right. It is the question of why the story has survived at all. Civilizations forget. Myths fade. Names dissolve into the silt of centuries. Yet the memory of an island that sank in a day and a night has been passed forward, generation after generation, across 2,400 years, by people who could not let it go. Whatever Plato heard in the Egyptian temple records, whatever Kircher believed he had recovered from the Vatican archives, the story possesses a gravity that no amount of failed expeditions has been able to dislodge. The map remains, the ocean remains, and somewhere in the unverifiable space between them, the most famous drowned civilization in human history continues to wait for the discovery that never comes. Number 1. The Piri Reis Map and the civilization that mapped a world we had not yet discovered. In 1929, during a renovation of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a curator sorting through Ottoman archives uncovered a fragment of gazelle skin parchment that had been folded away and forgotten for centuries. The fragment was a map. It was signed by Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis and dated 1513. And within minutes of its identification, scholars began to realize that the document on the table should not have existed. The surviving fragment is roughly a third of what was originally a larger world map. It is hand-painted in red, gold, and blue ink, dense with illustrations of ships under sail, animals from continents the Ottomans had barely encountered, and rulers seated on thrones in territories Europeans had only begun to glimpse. Compass roses radiate across the parchment in interlocking webs. The artistry alone marks it as a masterwork of 16th century cartography. But the artistry is not what unsettled the scholars who examined it. The map shows the coastline of South America. In 1513, 21 years after Columbus's first voyage, this was remarkable, but not impossible. Portuguese and Spanish explorers had begun charting the eastern coast of the new continent, and Piri Reis stated openly in his marginal notes that he had compiled the map from approximately 20 source documents, including charts that had belonged to Columbus himself. The South American coastline, while extraordinarily detailed for its era, can be explained. What cannot be explained, at least not easily, is what appears below it. The southern edge of the map shows a landmass extending eastward from the tip of South America. The coastline is drawn with confident specificity. Bays, inlets, mountain ranges rendered in the same careful hand as the rest of the document. And in 1966, a professor of the history of science at Keene State College named Charles Hapgood published a book titled Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, in which he argued that this landmass was Antarctica. Not Antarctica as it exists today, buried beneath 2 miles of ice. Antarctica as it would have appeared before the ice cover formed, with its underlying coastline exposed. The implications, if Hapgood was correct, are staggering. Antarctica was not officially sighted by human eyes until 1820. Its subglacial topography was not mapped until the seismic surveys of the International Geophysical Year in 1958. The ice cover that conceals the continent's true coastline has been in place for at least several thousand years, with most estimates pushing the figure into the tens of thousands. A map drawn in 1513 should not be able to depict the shape of land hidden beneath kilometers of ice. Hapgood took the argument further. The accuracy of the rendering, he claimed, was not the work of a 16th century cartographer extrapolating from rumor. It was the work of someone copying a much older source, a source produced by a civilization with the maritime reach, the surveying technology, and the geodetic knowledge to chart the southern continent before the ice arrived. Piri Reis himself wrote in his Marginalia that some of his source documents dated from the time of Alexander the Great. Hapgood proposed that they were older still, thousands of years older, mapped by people whose names we will never know, whose ships left no wrecks, whose ports lie beneath risen seas. Mainstream cartographers reject the interpretation. The southern landmass, they argue, is not Antarctica. It is the coast of South America itself, distorted by the projection conventions of early 16th century mapmakers, bent eastward to fit the available parchment, mislabeled by a tradition that confused the geography of the southern hemisphere. The resemblance to subglacial Antarctica, in this reading, is coincidence amplified by selective interpretation. The Piri Reis Map is extraordinary. It is not impossible. The debate has continued for nearly a century without resolution. What makes the Piri Reis Map the final entry on this list is not the certainty of what it shows. It is the question it forces us to ask. Piri Reis was not a mystic. He was a working Ottoman admiral who served his empire, kept meticulous records, and stated plainly in his own handwriting that the document he produced was a compilation. He named his sources. He pointed at older maps and said, "These are where my information came from." Some of those source maps survived into the 16th century. None of them survive today. They were copied, recopied, traded across centuries of Mediterranean commerce, and lost to fire, war, and time. If even one of those vanished originals contained information that should not have been available to its makers, then somewhere, at some point in the deep past, a civilization stood on a coastline we have not yet identified and drew what they saw. They mapped a world. The map outlived them, and a fragment of a copy of their work eventually found its way onto gazelle skin parchment in 1513, where it waited 400 years in a forgotten palace cabinet for someone to unfold it and ask who had drawn the original. The original is gone. The question is not. Step back from the countdown for a moment and look at what remains. 3 of these sites are real. Göbekli Tepe stands in Turkey, its T-shaped pillars carved by hands that predate agriculture itself. Doggerland's drowned valleys appear in bathymetric surveys of the North Sea, its hunters' tools still surfacing in fishing nets. The Olmec heads sit in Mexican museums, weathered green, their maker's true name lost. These are not theories. These are stone and sediment and bone. The rest is something else. Atlantis exists only in Plato's prose. Lemuria was conjured to explain lemur fossils and then drafted into mysticism. The civilization behind the Piri Reis Map is an interpretation layered onto a 16th century parchment whose source documents no longer exist. These are not discoveries. They are hypotheses built in the spaces where evidence runs out, and yet the pattern persists, because prehistoric means, by definition, before written records. Genuine maps from those eras are extraordinarily rare, almost entirely absent. We have no cartography from the people of Göbekli Tepe. We have no atlas from Doggerland. We have no log from whoever first walked the Sundaland plains before the sea took them. Whatever they knew about their world, whatever shorelines they traced in their minds, whatever stars they followed, none of it survived the transition into the literate age. What survived is the silhouette. Drowned coastlines, submerged stone, carvings that may be constellations, or may be nothing. The shape of forgotten cartography pressed faintly into the geological record, legible only in fragments. The people who made these places are gone. The maps they may have drawn are gone. What remains is the suspicion, quiet and persistent, that the history we have learned is only the surface of a much older drawing, and the rest of the lines lie beneath water that does not give them back. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.